Have you ever had that feeling that something was happening, but no one had the courage to say it out loud? That gnawing tension in your chest, like the world around you was whispering dark secrets that defy logic? That's exactly how Carolina's story began. What sounded like a cheap horror script quickly turned into one of the most disturbing and enigmatic cases ever connected to the Cathedral of Tijuana. A story so strange, it shook even the most skeptical among us. On the edge between the real and the impossible, this tale is steeped in fear, paranormal events, and consequences no one could have predicted. It all started with a radio show, a curious phone call, and a producer chasing ratings. But instead of higher ratings, he found nightmares. What seemed to be just another story of demonic possession meant to entertain listeners spiraled into an unexplainable phenomenon that left a deep mark on everyone involved. How do you explain voices speaking in unknown tongues, levitation, shadows that move on their own, or the sudden disappearance of a girl right in front of multiple witnesses? And what if I told you none of this came from a movie, but from recorded evidence and first-hand testimonies that were never fully explained? That's where the real question lies. Was this a real exorcism or carefully fueled mass hysteria? Get ready to dive into a story that blends faith, skepticism, fear, and a disturbing dose of mystery. A journey that begins inside a recording booth and ends with whispers in the cold streets of the city. This isn't just about believing or not, it's about facing whatever exists in the space between what we know and what we fear to admit. Are you ready to hear what many have chosen to forget? When I wrote this letter to you, Manuel, I'll admit I never thought I'd get to this point. I've always been a skeptic, you know, that the kind of person who needs to see it to believe it. But after Rogelio called me, the producer of that radio show about urban legends, something shifted. He wasn't the jumpy type, but this time he sounded shaken, almost breathless, telling me he had a case of demonic possession that needed a colder pair of eyes. I agreed to help, thinking it was just another exaggerated paranormal report. Nothing more. Rogelio explained the story came from a woman named Carmen, who lived near the coast. Her daughter, Carolina, was according to her taken by a force not of this world. At first, it sounded like a perfect story for the show's suspense, fear, mysticism. Classic audience bait. Nothing unusual, or so we thought. But when the girl began showing truly bizarre behavior, even Rogelio didn't know how to handle it. I still remember the first recording Rogelio played for me. It was Carmen describing her daughter's episodes, screaming at night, standing for hours staring into space, the house's temperature dropping suddenly. So far, so good, plenty of psychological or medical explanations. But then I heard something strange in the background. Carolina's voice emerged, speaking a mix of unknown languages. And something that sounded ancient. That recording could shake even the firmest non-believer. That's when I realized maybe this wasn't just cheap entertainment. And my doubts grew stronger when Rogelio asked me to join him in person. He said he trusted my clinical eye. I am a doctor, after all, trained to explain the unexplainable with science. But he also warned me if I agreed, I had to be prepared for things that logic alone couldn't handle. He said it seriously, with the tone of someone who had seen more than he could understand. I hesitated, of course. I'm not one to chase ghost stories. But there was something in his voice, a weight. A mix of fear and urgency. And deep down, I knew some stories only make sense when you live through them. So I said yes. And with that decision unaware, I opened the door to a chain of unexplainable events that would change my life, and the lives of many others, forever. At first, everything followed the usual script. Carmen's calls. Carolina's mother came into Rogelio's show with that typical flavor of local sensationalism. Screams in the background, stories of objects moving on their own, Shadows lurking in the corners of the house, exactly the kind of content audiences eat up. The team thought they were dealing with just another folk tale of demonic possession, like the ones you hear in country churches and traveling fairs. The plan was to explore the case responsibly, of course, but still make it compelling enough to keep listeners hooked. But bit by bit, the tone changed. What began as an exaggerated account started to take on darker, more serious dimensions. During one live call, Carolina's voice came on the air for the first time, and it wasn't just disturbing. It was wrong. Deep, guttural, coated with an accent no one could place. A voice in unknown tongues that sent chills through the studio and made listeners call in begging for them to shut it down. The audio engineers played the clip over and over, saying, "We can't explain what's on this tape." That's when things started to change inside the studio. Rogelio, once enthusiastic, now looked drained. Hollow eyes, sleepless nights, and a question no one wanted to ask: what if it's real? More and more people were calling in. Some claimed to have seen a woman in white near the family's home. Others had dreams where voices whispered Carolina in the dead of night. It was no longer just a spooky tale for ratings. Something was slipping out of control. The behind-the-scenes panic was almost immediate. Staff members started avoiding the recording booth at night. One, a superstitious type, said, "That thing's gonna bring bad luck." And it did. Every time Carmen called, the broadcast was hit with heavy interference static, warped sounds, as if something was crossing through the radio waves. Then came the first reports from listeners having panic attacks after hearing Carolina's voice. Real fear, spreading like wildfire. But the real turning point was a particular call. Carmen was on the line, mid-interview, when the call dropped and came back with Carolina's voice. Only now, she was laughing. A cold, echoing laugh that sounded like it came from inside a cave. Ratings plummeted, not from lack of interest, but because listeners couldn't stand to hear it anymore. What had started as just another radio show had become the epicenter of a potential supernatural case that no one wanted to keep airing, but no one could turn away from either. That night in the recording booth is burned into the memory of everyone who was there and in the files that were mysteriously deleted afterward. It was supposed to be a normal transmission. Carmen had called to give an update on Carolina, but right after it began, her voice changed. Without warning. It was like something had taken over the line. The voice that came through was hoarse, low, and felt like it wasn't coming from any physical space. The studio literally froze. The temperature dropped as if someone had opened the door to a walk-in freezer. Panic spread fast when the equipment started to fail. Lights flickering, mics hissing, massive static. And at the height of the transmission, every screen and monitor went black. Only that distorted voice in tongues remained, louder and deeper, as if it was inside everyone's heads. Rogelio collapsed from his chair, clutching his chest. One technician had a full-in panic attack. Meanwhile, listeners were calling frantically, claiming to hear screams and laughter coming from their radios even though the show had gone off air. That's when I got a text from Rogelio, just 3 words: "She's here." My blood ran cold. The next day, I went to the studio and found the booth locked from the inside, its walls scratched like something had clawed them from within. The air smelled strange, a mix of metal and something burnt. The previous night's recording? Gone. Simply gone. The technician swore he had backups. None of them worked. It was as if the recording had been erased by something that didn't want to be heard again. Worse still was the condition of the team. No one was sleeping well. Everyone was having nightmares about the woman in white, standing at the windows during the night. All the windows were covered after that. One receptionist quit, claiming she kept hearing footsteps in the hallway when she was alone. The atmosphere was unbearable. It wasn't just fear, it was something heavier, more oppressive. The booth had become an epicenter for something that didn't belong to this world. And the show? It continued at Rogelio's insistence. But no one treated it as just content anymore. The tension was constant, hanging in the air like thick smoke. It was as if Carolina, or whatever was inside her, was using the radio as a gateway. Some listeners reported headaches or nausea while hearing her voice. Others claimed their radios turned on by themselves at night, always tuned to the same frequency. It was like the possession had bled into the physical world. And that was just the beginning. The trip to Rosarito was wrapped in tense silence. Rogelio drove with his eyes locked on the road, no trace of his usual enthusiasm. The rest of the crew avoided saying anything about what they expected to find. When we arrived at Carmen's house, the atmosphere said it all: thick air, natural light that seemed to avoid the windows, and a strange cold, despite the Baja California sun. Carmen greeted us with a vacant look. She was exhausted, visibly drained, with the kind of dark circles that seemed tattooed by grief. "She's not my daughter anymore," she whispered. And I believed her. Carolina was upstairs. We climbed cautiously, filming everything with cameras and audio gear. When we opened her bedroom door, none of us were prepared for what we saw. The girl was levitating, hovering nearly half a meter above the ground. Arms outstretched, head bent backward, with a twisted, satisfied smile on her face. This was real. No camera trick, no mass hallucination. Rogelio dropped to his knees. One of the assistants vomited. Then she spoke, but the voice was male, adult, and echoed inside each of us. It said our names. All of them. Correctly. That's when Father Carlos stepped in. A simple man, steady voice, already experienced in exorcisms. He stood silently for a few seconds, watching Carolina, then pulled a small crucifix from his coat. "She needs to be taken," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a declaration. Carmen begged and cried, but there was no other choice. The regional bishop, reached by phone, gave an approval many believed would never come. Carolina would be transferred to the Cathedral of Tijuana to begin the rituals. Time was against us. Every hour, the signs of demonic possession grew stronger. On the way to the cathedral, the vehicle carrying Carolina had issues. A tire blew out inexplicably and the driver swore he saw a shadow dart across the road seconds before. The minor crash caused no injuries except to Carolina, who remained untouched, laughing hysterically like she'd just won something. When we arrived at the sacred site, a team was waiting with candles, prayers, and a carefully prepared environment. But even within the church's walls, the fear was palpable. Everyone knew this wouldn't be a routine exorcism. Father Carlos, calm but firm, gave us instructions: don't provoke her, never be alone, and under no circumstances try to speak directly to her. According to him, the entities that manifest in these cases are seductive, manipulative, and disturbingly intelligent. The ritual was about to begin. And despite being a doctor, a man of science and reason, I'll tell you, Manuel, when I had my first direct encounter with Carolina, my logic started to crumble. Science was no match for what we were about to witness inside that cathedral. Inside the Cathedral of Tijuana, everything had been arranged with ritualistic precision. Candles were lit in a circle, holy water sprinkled along the walls, and a support team composed of nuns and trusted parishioners stood nearby. Carolina sat at the center, tied to a reinforced wooden chair, but even then, the chair trembled and sometimes floated. Not dragged. Lifted. Father Carlos began praying in Latin, and her reaction was instant. Her eyes rolled back, and the room's temperature dropped so fast it felt like we were inside a vault. One of the attendees started bleeding from the nose for no reason. I, even with my medical background, couldn't move. Within the first few minutes, Carolina began speaking in at least 3 different languages, none of them taught in local schools. Father Carlos later confirmed hearing Aramaic, Latin, and what he believed to be Sumerian. Her body contorted in physically impossible ways, joints bending in directions they shouldn't without any visible pain. At times, she laughed and stared directly into someone's eyes, describing intimate sin secrets no one had ever confessed. With each revelation, the terror in the room deepened. One of the cameramen, a skeptic until that moment, dropped his gear and ran, screaming that something had entered his ear. The supernatural manifestations escalated. Candles exploded without warning. Crucifixes fell from walls untouched. Whispers floated across the room even when no one spoke. More than once, we saw dark figures darting between the cathedral's pillars, shadows with a will of their own. It felt like the presence inside Carolina had extended beyond her body and was now contaminating the space itself. Breathing became heavy, the air thick and oppressive. Her voice echoed twice, as if coming from 2 directions at once. It was impossible not to feel we were being watched not by one entity, but by many. Then everything spiraled. Carolina floated off the chair, eyes completely black, and screamed so loud the stained glass windows shook in their frames. Father Carlos was on his knees, drenched in sweat, barely able to keep the prayers going. Some of the witnesses fainted. Others wept, paralyzed, like statues. I felt my heart beating out of rhythm, erratic and uneven. It was like being in the presence of a raw force, a living energy, intelligent and cruel. It was then that I understood this wasn't just a demonic possession. This was something that fed off collective fear, and we had all become its source. Hours later, Carolina collapsed onto the floor, unconscious. The session was over or paused. No one believed that was the end. Father Carlos, exhausted, said the spirit was far too strong and not alone. It would take more time, more strength. But he warned us we had crossed a line. All of us who had been exposed were now inside this entity's reach. And if he was right, none of us would walk out without carrying an invisible mark. The first attempt to contain her happened 2 days after the initial ritual. Carolina had been asleep nearly non-stop since then until she woke up screaming, a shriek that echoed through the north wing of the Cathedral of Tijuana. When we reached her room, the ropes were loose. But hey race the thing, they weren't untied, they looked unraveled, as if the fibers had disintegrated. Carolina was gone. The door was still locked from the outside. No one could explain how she got out. Moments later, a group of parishioners saw her walking barefoot through the courtyard, wearing a white nightgown, laughing. When they got close, she vanished like a shadow pulled by the wind. The team, now in full panic mode, tried to double down on containment. Crucifixes were mounted on every door. Cameras were installed. 2 priests were assigned to watch her around the clock. Still, the phenomena escalated. Surveillance showed her walking the halls while she was supposedly asleep in another room. One volunteer swore he saw her peeking from behind the altar. And perhaps the most disturbing, a security camera caught a white-clad female figure crossing the sacristy at 3:17 a.m., a time the clergy referred to as the inversion of the holy hour. But nothing shook us more than the second escape. During a special purification mass, Carolina was surrounded by 4 people including Father Carlos. In just seconds, they all claimed to experience a kind of mental blackout. When they regained awareness, she was gone. Again. All that remained was a black stain on the floor and a message scrawled on the wall in crooked letters, "I see you." That phrase chilled even the most faithful. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. The church no longer felt sacred, it felt breached. Even in the streets of Tijuana, rumors began to spread. People said they saw a pale girl wandering at night, mumbling unintelligible words. Some swore she showed up near hospitals, closed schools, and of course churches. Fear spread like smoke. Locals began to avoid the cathedral entirely. "That place isn't holy anymore," some would mutter. Even the homeless crossed the street rather than walk past it. Carolina's name was now whispered. And the nickname "the woman in white" became widespread, as if naming the phenomenon was safer than confronting its origin. By that point, Rogelio was a wreck. The radio show was hanging by a thread, but he insisted on documenting everything. He said we had to keep going for truth's sake, or maybe because he feared that stopping would give the thing more room to grow. The few loyal listeners who remained began reporting oddities, nightmares featuring Carolina, electronics breaking when they played her recordings, and entire episodes vanishing from archives. The message was clear: Carolina couldn't be contained. And every failed attempt seemed to make her stronger. The days following Carolina's last disappearance were shrouded in a kind of silent mourning. There was no funeral, no memorial mass. Because, truthfully, no one knew for sure if she was dead. But the looks on people's faces said everything: something had died, even if no one could name it. Rogelio tried to keep the show going for a few more weeks, but the energy was gone. Calls from listeners became stranger. Some claimed they could hear Carolina whispering faintly in the background of live broadcasts even when no one else was speaking. Others, who re-listened to old episodes, woke up with marks on their bodies. One of the crew members, Javier, couldn't take the pressure. Had been showing signs of paranoia for weeks. Eventually, he was found dead in his apartment, surrounded by empty bottles and notebooks scribbled with meaningless symbols. The official report said alcohol poisoning, but everyone knew had been swallowed by something he couldn't explain and couldn't escape. Carmen, Carolina's mother, was seen wandering the city, holding a photo of her daughter, asking strangers if they'd seen her. She became a familiar sight around the cathedral. "She visits me every night," she'd say. "Always in white." Father Carlos, once so sure of himself, now walked with a hunched back, as if carrying an invisible weight. He withdrew from public ceremonies, refused interviews, and vanished from church records. Some said he was sent to a distant convent for spiritual recovery. Others whispered about a nervous breakdown. As for me, I spent months in therapy, trying to organize the chaos in my mind. As a doctor, I tried to rationalize the events. But as a human being, I lost. The line between sanity and madness becomes dangerously thin when you're exposed to something truly inexplicable for too long. Eventually, the radio show was officially canceled. The final broadcast aired late one night without a planned script. The show went live completely alone and played an audio file no one had seen before. It sounded like Carolina, saying, "I'm still here," but the voice was softer, almost resigned. The file was never found again. And even after the show ended, the stories didn't stop. Locals still claimed to see a woman in white walking the cathedral grounds, especially on cloudy nights. Sometimes, she just walks. Other times, she stands motionless, staring at the windows. She never speaks. But her presence still gives people chills. So now, after everything, what do you believe? That it was all just mass hysteria fueled by rumor and fear? Or could it be that something exists out there, something beyond what we can explain with words, science, or faith? I'm not here to convince you of anything. far from it. But if there's one thing I've learned from this story, it's this: the unknown doesn't need your belief to exist. It simply appears, watches, and sometimes touches us in ways we never forget. How many times have you brushed off a strange chill or an inexplicable shiver down your spine? What if those were signs? What if there are forces that go beyond logic, beyond everything we think we understand, and they only reveal themselves to those who dare to look closer? Maybe you're already living your own version of the supernatural and haven't even noticed. Or maybe you're running from something you can no longer deny. In the end, the real question isn't whether Carolina was truly possessed. It's about how we, as people, face fear, the loss of control, and the moments when reality slips through our fingers. If this was just a myth, just a story, then why do so many people feel the same fear? The same symptoms? Why do the shadows keep showing up when reason fails? If this story stirred something in you, made you curious, made you question things, or maybe even gave you that uncomfortable chill, then maybe, just maybe, something inside you is waking up. Maybe you're more connected to the invisible world than you think. So raise my invitation. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join a community that doesn't run from the dark. We walk through it, with our eyes wide open.